Our first speaker of the second session is Ciaran Reilly. Ciaran is a historian of 19th and 20th century Ireland at the Arts and Humanities Institute at Nineteenth University. His interests are wide-ranging, from the Great Irish Famine to country houses and landed estates, and on to the Irish Revolution of 1912 to 1923. The period being marked by the decade of centenaries, from which we are, I think, finally maybe beginning to emerge. He's a founding member of the European Forum for the Study of Country Houses and Landed Estates, and he'll begin this second session by telling us about a house in transition, Leinster House, in the early 19th century.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Colin, for the warm welcome and the introduction. I'm delighted to be here today to speak at the symposium, and my thanks indeed to Dennis Bergen for the invitation to do so. This morning I want to speak about a house in transition, a snapshot of life in Leinster House as presented in the private diaries of a teenager who frequented Leinster House at the turn of the 19th century. After the chance discovery of these diaries a few years ago, I'm delighted to share them here with you this morning, and I hope that you find them interesting and that they will contribute to what we've already heard from Nicola and Patricia. In 1794, as Patricia has already highlighted, James Malton described Leinster House as being, quote, the most stately private edifice in the city, and that it had, quote, prospects few places can exhibit. 20 years later, when the Dublin Society, which would later become the Royal Dublin Society, visited Leinster House, having obtained permission from the Duke of Leinster in December of 1814 to do so, they reported that they found the structure, quote, to be of a strong and permanent nature, and fit for the purpose of a society and a situation much more eligible than the present one occupied by them. In the middle of the 20 years which separates these two descriptions, by Malton in 1794 and by the Dublin Society in 1814, the use of Leinster House by the Fitzgeralds, Dukes of Leinster, was changing significantly. Once a house of residence for the family where the upper echelons of Dublin society were entertained and high politics discussed, by the early years of the 19th century, their use of Leinster House was becoming more infrequent. Very much the preserve of the female members of the Fitzgerald family, their Dublin townhouse remained an important place for social interaction, however, although the Duke of Leinster preferred to retire to Carton near Maynooth in County Kildare. There the Duke and his young sons revelled in the freedom of the Kildare countryside, and that they did. Long before there was golf at Carton, there was other sports. The decision to favour Carton may also have reflected the Duke's desire for his two sons, Augustus Frederick and Lord Kildare, Lord Kildare, and Lord William, to receive private education. Carton provided a better location to do so, where both study and leisure could be suitably mixed. For that end, a private tutor was hired to provide a grounding in a number of studies, including maths, languages, and the classics, before their entry to the English schooling system at Eton and Oxford. This paper today examines the world of Leinster House and Fitzgerald's in the early 19th century through the eyes of that tutor, Henry Edward Joly. For more than 30 years, Joly and his family were intimates of the House of Leinster and played an important role in their lives. But who were the Jolys, and who was Henry Edward Joly? Born in 1740 in the town of Charnoux, near Liège, in modern-day Belgium, Jean Jasper Joly was the patriarch of the family in Ireland. In January 1756, Joly, then described as a citizen of Hungary and Bohemia, was issued a passport to travel far and wide without disruption. His passport also noted that, quote, he journeys from time to time in the towns and country districts lying around us, sometimes with a companion known to him, by the mercy of God, freed from all contagious diseases and making profession of the Catholic Apostolic faith. Leaving Calais in May 1764 in the employment of an English merchant, a man called John Osborne, Joly toured the continent, which included a visit to Rome in 1767. From there he visited the Vatican and bought indulgences in April 1767 after he was invited to an audience with Pope Clement XIII. A short while after this meeting with the Pope, Joly met with William Robert Fitzgerald, the second Duke of Leinster, and then himself Lord Kildare. who was undertaking his grand tour of Europe at the time. Having grossly overspent on the tour, Fitzgerald had hit on hard times before the meeting with Jolie. It is believed that Jolie then gave him a loan of £1,000 to help Lord Kildare to continue on his tour. Delighted by this act of generosity, Fitzgerald invited him to be his personal secretary, and together they travelled across Europe, visiting amongst other places Milan, Venice, Dresden and Berlin, before eventually returning to Ireland on the 5th of October 1769. Quickly settling into life in Ireland and his new role as Lord Kildare's private secretary, Jolie became a Freemason of the Dublin city in 1774 and later that year converted to Protestantism. Whether or not this conversion was a requirement of Lord Kildare's, who had succeeded to the dukedom the previous year on the death of his father James, is unclear. Certainly his promotion to the position of doorkeeper of the House of Lords in June 1775 had much to do with the Duke's influence. The position at the House of Lords was a lucrative post, coming as it did with an annual salary of £100, which also brought Jolie into the highest social echelons of Dublin. The second Duke of Leinster's reference was glowing in praise for Jolie, noting that he was, quote, sober, faithful, diligent, a Protestant, and one very capable of performing the duty and service of a doorkeeper. He quickly won fame within the House of Lords and is credited with the rescue of 2 tapestries when the House of Lords went on fire on the 27th of February 1792. These tapestries, the valiant defence of Londonderry and the glorious battle and victory of the Boyne, were made by Jean van Bever in 1732. In reward for his bravery, he was presented with a copy of both tapestries in oils by James Mahony, and they now hang privately in a house in County Kildare. Jolie continued to serve the Duke of Leinster in all capacities and was pictured with him in Francis Wheatley's painting of the Irish Volunteers when they met in College Green in 1779. I didn't include that picture today, but if you're familiar with the picture of the Volunteers, the Duke of Leinster is in the middle and Jolie is directly behind him. By the early 1790s, Jolie had applied for naturalisation papers, while further public positions included his appointment as 3rd Lieutenant of the 1st Company of Stephen's Green Infantry during the 1798 rebellion. This position is particularly interesting in light of the role of Lord Edward Fitzgerald, a United Irishman and brother of the Duke of Leinster, who was killed, as Patricia noted, on the 23rd of May 1798. Indeed, in the Jolie family lore, Lord Edward was shielded from English soldiers during those early stages of the rebellion, or the weeks before them, at the Jolie family home on Harcourt Terrace in Dublin. For over 50 years until his death in 1825, Jean-Jasper Jolie remained a close confidant of the Leinster family. The family connections were further underlined by the fact that some of Jolie's family were born at Carton House, while others were christened at Leinster House. Indeed, Jolie's eldest daughter, Emily, christened her child Augustus Frederick in honour of the 2nd Duke's eldest son. Moreover, the child's sponsors included Lady Isabella Fitzgerald, Lord Kildare, while Lord William was also present at this christening. Again, the close family connections were evident in the fact that the christening took place at Leinster House, while Lord Edward Fitzgerald acted as godfather for Henry Edward Jolie and Emily Fitzgerald, his godmother. The birth of Augustus Frederick, 10th child born to the 2nd Duke of Leinster and his wife, Olivia Usher St. George, in 1791, heralded huge celebrations in Maynooth and on the outlying portions of the Leinster estate in Kildare, including the towns of Rathangan and Athy. Primed to succeed his father as Duke of Leinster and Ireland's premier peer, the education of Augustus Frederick was a task which was not chosen lightly. And maybe perhaps, as Patricia has outlined about Mr. Ogilvie, perhaps they wanted to avoid that situation arising again. In 1801, it was decided that a tutor would be brought to Leinster House and then to Carton to prepare the Fitzgerald boys before their entry to Eton and to Oxford. To this end, and owing to the father's close connections with the family, Henry Jolie, eldest son of Jean-Jasper Jolie, was chosen as tutor, spending long periods with the Fitzgerald children where lessons were carried out on an almost daily basis. Arriving at Carton in June 1801, the then 17-year-old Jolie quickly settled into his new role as tutor. His brief was simple: educate Augustus Frederick and William in the morning and entertain them in the evening. At all times, the children were to be in his care. And it was a position, it seems, he revelled in, enjoying the Carton landscape where hunting, fishing and shooting were the order of the day, following their studies. And naturally, this was a welcome break for Jolie himself, who was then a student of Trinity College, an absence from which frequently landed him in trouble from the college authorities. On the 12th of June 1802, for example, he notes in his diary, quote, "Saw Mr. Usher at the college, not punished, thankfully, for the last week." As tutor, Jolie was given free rein at Carton in terms of what he taught the children, and his lessons often reflected his own studies at Trinity College, particularly Greek and Roman mythology, Latin and scripture. However, it was not a simple task to educate the children. Remember, they were 11 and 9 years of age, respectively. And he was often forced to discipline them. Quote, "Lord Kildare and William very ill-tempered all day," was a frequent entry in the diary, and there appears to have been times a struggle between him and the children. While Jolie's diaries provide us an insight into the education of the Fitzgerald children, they also provide an insight into the sporting and leisure pursuits of aristocratic children in the early 19th century. Fireworks, for example, were frequently displayed at Carton for the young boys, and no expense was spared in the procurement. On the occasion of Lord Kildare's birthday, for example, fireworks were arranged to represent the letter K. Jolie recorded the evening's entertainment at Carton in his diary. "We let off 9 sky, 7 table, 2 line rockets, 18 fire pumps, 10 Catherine wheels, 4 serpent boxes, 24 squirts. Mr. Long's coat," he was the steward, "was entirely burnt by a fire pump. There was a grand supper laid out in the gallery." Having attended to their schooling diligently, the children were rewarded with fishing and shooting expeditions throughout the domain and beyond, always accompanied by Jolie. And here they were given free rein. By modern standards, it might seem incredible now to think that children as young as 9 and 11 were given free charge of guns. Indeed, Lord Kildare had a cross cannon on most times travelling around Maynooth. One such expedition near the town of Maynooth was said to have lasted several hours, where Lord Kildare used a small Spanish gun, a hawking bag and a trumpet. Jolie conceded that Kildare was, quote, "quite a good shot," and claimed that he could kill 2 pigeons with 1 shot. These expeditions to Maynooth and beyond were usually undertaken with their favourite mule, which they called Bonnie Kilroo. On an occasion, the children represented the second Duke of Leinster at social gatherings, including at Maynooth College, recently formed following a gift of land from the Leinster family. And it indeed is incredible to believe that the young Lord Kildare and Lord William actually presented the prize-giving gifts to the students of Maynooth College in 1801 and 1802. Henry Jolie's tenure as tutor to the young Fitzgeralds during 1801 and 1802 also provides us with an illuminating and intimate portrait of life at Leinster House and of the Fitzgeralds. When not at Carton, Jolie visited here on an almost weekly basis, usually when going to and from his studies at Trinity College. A 15-minute walk from his home on Harcourt Terrace, Jolie and his mother, Mary Romley, were frequent guests of the Fitzgerald household. Leinster House, it seems, was the place to go in Dublin, a house for socialising and interacting with the leading members of Dublin society at the time. On occasion, Jolie often visited the house on more than one occasion during a single day. Quote, "Called twice at Leinster House" is a frequent entry in his diaries in March of 1802. His visits also included fishing expeditions and walking through the streets of Dublin, in which he brought the young lords. However, he never dined at Leinster House, despite all of his visits and his work there. Perhaps that was evidence of his own status there, or perhaps the fact that he was only 15 minutes from home. Before beginning his work as tutor to the Dukes of Leinster's sons, Jolie was also engaged in a number of other positions at Leinster House, including the cataloguing of books in the library, many of which had belonged to Lord Edward Fitzgerald. Jolie took great pride in arranging Lord Edward's library during the summer of 1802, much of which was later moved to Carton. However, in the diaries, he offers no comment on what he thought of Lord Edward, his actions in 1798, or indeed what he thought of his godfather. As a 17-year-old boy, Jolie, it appears, was often asked to attend Leinster House to entertain and to provide company simply for Lords Augustus Frederick and William. Their stays in Dublin were often short-lived, and after a night or two they would return to Carton. Entries in Jolie's diary reflect these visits to Leinster House. For example, on the 2nd of March 1802, he notes, quote, "Went to Leinster House to see the young lord, stayed with him all day." On another occasion, Jolie notes in his diary, quote, "The young lords came to town and I was required to visit and to entertain them." For Jolie, there were other reasons and curiosities for which to visit Leinster House. In April of 1802, for example, he went there to see a show of cattle which had been brought there. But as he comments in his diary, they were nearly all killed by the time I got there. On another occasion, he noted, quote, "I went to Leinster House in the morn with some bundles of sticks for the lady." They were also avid gardeners, and they often visited Leinster House with fruits and vegetables. These were grown in the family garden at Harcourt Terrace, and the family were obviously proud of their exploits. Quote, "Father sent 60 apples in a basket to the young lords," Jolie noted in April 1802. When not in Leinster House himself, Jolie notes in his diary when other family members visited, evidence that this was still a place worthy of note, although in the Duke's absence it was all the lesser for it. By the early 19th century, the Fitzgeralds split their time between Carton and Leinster House, although the Duke of Leinster, as I mentioned, preferred to remain at Carton. And there are many entries of the Duke visiting Dublin and returning to Carton on the same day by his own private post chase, which took about 2 hours journey. Here, as I said, the Duke revelled in the Kildare countryside, as did his sons. And his presence in Carton is despite the fact that the interior of the house, according to Jolie, was by now very much dilapidated. Occupants were forced to change bedrooms on a regular basis to avoid damp and rain. And it gives us some indication as to why perhaps Richard Morrison was needed and Carton was eventually overhauled following the sale of Leinster House in 1815. In contrast, preferring the social climes of Dublin, the Fitzgerald girls were more inclined to spend time at Leinster House. At least the diaries would reflect this. And there they met with other members of the aristocracy and the neighbouring Kildare gentry, who seemed to favour visiting Leinster House. And the women included Lady Mary, whose husband Sir Charles Ross was serving in the British Army at the time, Lady Emily Henry, wife of John Henry of Strathfield, and the other daughters, Lady Elizabeth, Lady Cecilia, and Lady Isabella. Visitors to the house at this time included the Shaws, the Napiers, and the Taylors, families with whom the Jolies were often regularly in contact also. Leinster House provided an opportunity for the women to regale each other with the latest fashions, news, and more importantly, gossip, although perhaps it is too simplistic to define their lives as such. In the first instance, it seems that the Fitzgerald women, or Jolie was more acquainted with the Fitzgerald women, calling on them on a weekly basis. But he was also a confidant of other members of the Fitzgerald family, including Lord Robert, a brother of the second Duke of Leinster, with whom he communicated, noting in his diary about the letters he received, although he doesn't give us any indication about the contents of those letters. Jolie was also the conduit for the transport of personal goods and effects from Leinster House to Carton, and was often called upon to do so. He was required at short notice to serve at Leinster House or Carton, and within minutes of receiving word that he was needed at either, he was on his way. Indeed, on the very day that his sister Amelia gave birth to her first child, who she called Augustus Frederick, his presence at Carton was required. He notes in his diary, quote, "Lord William having wrote a letter to us inviting us to go to Carton, we set off in the horse chaise with Mr. Long at 5 o'clock, and we arrived at Carton at 7. And the diaries also reflect some of the major events of the time and how they affected both the Jolies and the House of Leinster, including, for example, the celebration of the signing of the Peace of Amiens in 1802. As news spread throughout the city in late March, Jolie notes, quote, "The park guns were fired and we all went to watch the illuminations." Some entries have not been fully unpacked, but do provide further information about Jolie and his connection to the Leinsters. In April 1802, for example, he notes in his diary, quote, "Went to Leinster House, Lord Robert had asked Mr. Usher if we were capable to tutor to his sons." Now this entry is interesting because Lord Robert at this stage hadn't got any sons, but perhaps it was meant his female children. Whether or not, much of Jolie's diaries, when not at Carton or Leinster House, contain the mundane aspects of his life. Frequent entries about visitors to his own house are included. And more often than not, he is writing about planting and gardening at Harcourt Terrace and reading books, acquiring books. Of course, the Jolies were Henry, this man, his son Jasper Robert Jolie was the donor of over 25,000 books to the National Library. Of course, when you visit the National Library, you will see the Jolie tea rooms, which are named after the family. So we can begin to see the assemblage of this vast library collection by the family. So, with all this mundane parts of his life, it's easy to assume that interactions with the House of Leinster and visits to Leinster House and the Carton was something that was worth noting, and obviously something which he revelled in. And I should just show you, that's Augustus Frederick, 3rd Duke of Leinster. These are just some of the entries in the diary. You can see there, went to Leinster House, that's the one I spoke about. Lord Robert asked Mr. Usher if we were capable to be tutors to his lords, etc. And he sailed for England that night. That's the frontispiece of the diary. Henrique Edward Jolie, and you can see here that a letter from Lord Edward inviting us to go to Carton. I called twice at Leinster House. While in the mid-18th century, as Patricia and Nicola have mentioned this morning, Carton was renowned for its lavish interior, most notably the Gold Saloon. By 1800, according to Jolie, the house needed a major overhaul, and with mounting debts which crippled the family fortunes, improvements were often overlooked. Contemporary opinions of Carton were frequently unflattering. A visitor to the house in 1799, for example, complained that it was, quote, "the shabbiest dinner I have ever saw at a great man's table." Likewise, in 1802, Philip York, 3rd Earl of Hardwicke, and then Lord Lieutenant of Ireland, visited Carton and noted that while, quote, "it was a very fine place with extensive plantations in an ugly country, the house is not good." Moreover, the early years of the 19th century were undoubtedly precarious, as we've heard already, coming as it did in the wake of the 1798 rebellion and the involvement of Lord Edward in that ill-fated movement. Added to this was the loss of the Duke of Leinster's control of the parliamentary boroughs and the financial security that they brought. However, he was rewarded handsomely for his backing of the Act of Union eventually. However, this was not enough to offset the mounting debts he had inherited from his father, as Patricia estimated, in the region of £150,000. Further compounding matters was the yearly drain on the estate finances, which jointures and marriage settlements brought. The second Duke, William Robert Fitzgerald, had 5 daughters before the birth of an heir, all of whom exacted an annual charge on the estate. The early years of the 19th century also witnessed the outbreak of the Emmet Rebellion in 1803, and while the Duke of Leinster pleaded to be oblivious of the seditious activity in Maynooth, it certainly done him no favours. References to Jolie being moved from room to room on a nightly basis while staying in Carton indicate work was urgently needed. All in all, Carton was a pale shadow of its former self. For the Duke of Leinster and his family, it was very much a case of maintaining outward appearances as the cracks began to emerge inside. In 1816, the year after the sale of Leinster House was completed, Henry Edward Jolie was appointed a rector of Clonsast in East Kings County, now modern County Offaly. He would later become the Church of Ireland Archdeacon of Killala and Chancellor of Kildare. Positions, it seems, were brought about by the influence of the 3rd Duke of Leinster, the man he had tutored at Carton and Leinster House. Through Henry Jolie's diaries, we get a sense of life at Leinster House and Carton at the turn of the 19th century, during the final years of ownership of Leinster House by the Fitzgerald family. The diaries are an important addition to the historiography of Leinster House and the final years as a home to the House of Leinster. If Leinster House was in transition at that time, so too was the House of Leinster. Within 2 years of the diaries being written, a 13-year-old Augustus Frederick would inherit the vast Leinster estates, which included 70,000 acres of land in County Kildare. The final days of Leinster House as a place of residence for the Fitzgeralds was now at hand. Thank you very much.